So you're playing Europa Universalis IV for a few thousand hours and you think you know everything. Okay, then name every single province in the game. My name is Ludiet, and in today's video we'll be going through some of the most advanced game mechanics that even the more veteran players are struggling with. We'll be discussing how to play toll in Europa Universalis IV, how to get rich from properly managing and understanding trade, and how combat works, best division templates, and how to win wars when outnumbered. So what exactly does playing toll mean, and how can we achieve that? Playing toll is not necessarily staying as a one province minor or a smaller nation, but it means to maximize the output from whatever provinces you have. Of course, having less provinces and not expanding makes it easier to play toll, but your location is vital when it comes down to it, as the trade nodes you're a part of and the starting development as well as the trade goods that your provinces have will play a vital role in playing more efficiently. There are a few nations that truly excel at playing toll due to their starting location, namely the various smaller Dutch minor nations, Florence, as well as the North Italian nations, England, France, Poland, and Korea. Now I know some of these nations might surprise you, as you would expect England, France, Poland to be prime examples of blobbing nations, and they definitely can become massive blobs. But should you choose to play toll and not necessarily expand as England, France, Poland, they have some of the best lands, mostly farmlands and grasslands, in which it's actually cheaper to develop provinces or lack any development penalty as you would have in woods and other types of terrains. Plus, as is the case with England and France, they have the best trade node at their doorstep. Remember what I said? It's about efficiently maximizing what you get out of your lands and not about being a small nation. You can even develop your provinces for just 25 power before the first month of the game has passed, if you wish, as the British, by following the big brain moves we'll be showing off in this video. Of course, the most important part about playing toll is developing provinces, and the cheaper you can develop a province for, the better. First thing we do when developing a province, of course, is set the encourage development edict in the provinces where we plan on developing. Edicts do increase the maintenance cost of your provinces by 200%, so make sure you set this only when you will be developing, not before, and cancel the edict or change it to a more suitable edict 1 year after. There are certain privileges that can help lower development costs, such as the English exclusive trade rights for the burghers, which lowers development costs by 15% in provinces that have a center of trade, as is the case in York, Lincolnshire, and even London. Another 10% development cost can be reached by going over 60% loyalty and influence with your burgher estate, and that's also why we're able to develop this particular province for just 25 power. But that's just the tip of the development cost reduction spear though. You can get 10% development reduction from having 100% prosperity in your state, and can get 15% more reduction each time you expand infrastructure. Remember that expanding infrastructure can be done once every 15 development. The capital also gets a development cost reduction based on the total development of the country, and the type of terrain can also lower development cost if it is farmlands, which is why some nations, as you can imagine, Spain, doesn't necessarily have too many great development reduction modifiers from its lands, since it is predominantly either grasslands or drylands, not as many farmlands as the English have, the French lands have, the Polish lands have, and so on. Your center of trade level also lowers development. The higher the center of trade level, the bigger the development cost reduction, and at level 3 it affects the entire area, meaning it only costs 10 power for us to develop the province of Cuenca because of the World Trade Center we have in Toledo. Certain monuments such as the Prambanan Temple in Majapahit can also lower development costs globally or locally depending on the monument. National ideas also lower development cost, with certain nations having higher development cost reduction modifiers than others. Some of you probably know about Holland, about Florence, and so on, but I'm sure not many of you know that Geneva actually has the highest development cost reduction modifier in all of Europe, with minus 15% development cost, as their first unlockable idea, making this quote-unquote the best national idea set for playing toll in Europe at least. And Alaska has the highest development cost reduction national ideas as a formable nation, so if you don't start as Geneva, you can always form Alaska for these amazing both playing toll and militaristic ideas. Idea groups also hold dev cost reduction modifiers. With plutocratic, aristocratic, and divine ideas, you get -5%. Infrastructure also give -10% when fully unlocked, and certain policies such as indigenous with infrastructure give -5%, and economic with defensive gives -10% in primary culture provinces. As you advance in technology, you get development cost reduction modifiers at level 17, 23, and 27. There's also missions that can further lower the development cost reduction modifier, as well as remember that innovativeness also lowers the cost of all power interactions, including developing provinces, so it is always worth it investing in getting innovativeness up to 100. Now that we have an idea of what can help lower development cost reduction, the real question is, when should we develop provinces and when should we prioritize using our power in other ways, such as increasing our technology, our stability. In general, you want to make sure that you have at least the same level technologically speaking as your neighbors, but it's okay to fall back in diplomatic and admin tech as long as your military tech is at least on par with your neighbors or better. The AI will likely attack you if it sees you as weaker than it is, and having the same or better military is vital in surviving any surprise attack. As for diplo and admin technology, if you have an overflow of power, you can of course use it and get the technology before anybody else, which will also increase your innovativeness. And at 100 innovativeness, you also get -10% power cost reduction for everything, but this is of course highly situational on how exactly you're playing your game, the amount of mana that you're generating with your advisors, your leader and such, and what kind of a playstyle you're going for. For example, in this particular save, as the Muscovites, I am definitely not playing tall. We're pretty much the widest you can get in the game, and I am okay with falling behind in admin and diplomatic technology early on in the campaign, as we will eventually catch up with this technology, since me using the diplo and the admin power early on for expansion means that I will be slowly gaining more manpower and more economy compared to my neighbors, and I can just not attack anyone, sit on my current gains, kill off whatever rebels spawn, and catch up with my technology. The benefit of me having expanded so much is that I will be gaining more manpower and economy faster than my neighbors will, since I have more provinces overall, and whilst I'm catching up with my technology, I'm also waiting for my coalition to dissipate if I have any, or overall for my country to stabilize a little bit more before I continue expanding again. This is in stark contrast to a gameplay as Florence, for example, where we can of course be the first ones to get military admin and diplomatic technology, since we start with a very good leader, meaning we have a lot of extra power generation per month, and because we're in a region where there's very high aggressive expansion when you take provinces, we will be expanding significantly less, or we will be expanding via vassals, as such conserving even more of our power, so we can use the excess then if we have at least the same level of tech as all of our neighbors or higher, and we have enough ideas. Whatever's overflowing from that, of course, we can use to develop provinces. Take note, in general, you also want to always have at least one stability, as having one stability means that you will be getting prosperity passively in your provinces based on the skills of your leader, in our case Cosimo, which is a 655 leader, adding up to 80% chance that we increase prosperity by 1 every month, which in turn means once we reach 100 prosperity, we get that development cost reduction, but also the goods produced modifier plus 25 that is very crucial towards having a proper, strong economy no matter what the size. And in general, in the first 50 years or so, you should always strive towards starting your first golden era that again lowers all power costs by 10%. In my opinion, the golden era is best used after the 1480s, 1490s, when you actually start getting your idea groups, at least the first 2 or maybe 3 idea groups unlocked, to make it cheaper to unlock all of the ideas in your idea group. So now that we learned about developing provinces, we must also know about buildings, as playing toll is not just about developing, but also having an optimal distribution of buildings within your country. There's certain buildings that you quite literally want to have built everywhere that you can. The first on this list is, of course, the courthouse and its upgrade, the town hall. This building doesn't take up a building slot, and it lowers monthly autonomy, lowers the state maintenance cost and province governing cost, allowing you to have more provinces if you're expanding, or lowering the cost of having high development provinces, since remember, one development is one governing capacity. If you have 28 development in a province, by building a courthouse, we lower that to 21 governing cost rather than 28. The next vital building is the workshop and its upgrade, the counting house. As you progress in your campaign, production and trade will be your main sources of income. In the early campaign, tax is king, but after the mid-1550s, it sharply switches to a production/trade economy, with tax not scaling as massively as the other two, so a workshop counting house in every province, since the higher your production development, the more you get out of those provinces. Barracks and training fields are the third vital building, but the exception here is if you're for some reason lacking building slots, you can prioritize high manpower development provinces until you get the additional building slot to have this building everywhere. As the game progresses, manpower is absolute king. Churches and cathedrals is alright early game, but if you need the building slot, you can always replace it later with a more appropriate building, as it doesn't scale as much in the late game. However, if you upgrade what your churches give by, say, going for the expand temple rights government reform, which increases tax and lowers unrest by -2 for churches and cathedrals, then it is worth having churches and cathedrals in every single province. Manufactories, you of course want to go for the most income that you get from your manufactories. Usually that is going to be cloth provinces, copper, glass, paper, and so on. Only exception from that, of course, is the soldier's household. Rather than having a manufactory, it's better to have a soldier's household in livestock, fish, wine, and grain provinces, as it does offer double the amount of manpower from those particular trade goods. State house, of course, you can also build it if you're really lacking governing costs, and this also provides double the bonus in paper, glass, and gem provinces, but in most games it's best to just have manufactories everywhere, with the exception of soldiers' households in, again, grain, fish, livestock, and wine provinces. Furnaces are available after admin technology 21 in coal provinces, which you get much later in the campaign. They do give a global bonus of +5% goods produced modifier, so if you have 10 furnaces, you get 50% goods produced modifier for all your goods, which is pretty much an increase in your entire economy by 50% more or less. So obviously furnaces are to be built everywhere as soon as you have those coal provinces available. The marketplace and its upgrades are only to be built in high trade power provinces. So usually that's provinces with centers of trade, entree ports, special modifiers on the province that increase the trade power, such as a natural harbor, and not in every single province, as the amount of bonus you get from having these in most provinces is not really worth it. Regimental camps and shipyards, obviously, if you really need to increase your land force limit, of course, build that up, but in most cases, you should have enough land force limit from your national ideas, as well as from the idea groups that you select, with, of course, a few exceptions. Coastal defense and naval batteries are good if you're getting raided by another pirate nation, so this is a very situational type of building. Most cases, you're not going to be raided by pirates, and it is a pretty expensive building overall, takes up a building slot as well, so in most cases, I would say it's best to just get a truce with whoever's raiding you, or just taking their coastline, as I did with the Barbary Coast Pirates, rather than actually building a naval battery. It's time to switch over the conversation to trade as a whole, figure out how it works and how to maximize our trade output. If you go to the trade map mode, you notice that there's two types of nodes. End trade nodes such as the English Channel node, Genoa, and Venice, and then there is non-end trade nodes, which is every other node in the game with the exception of these three already mentioned. The difference is that trade does not filter out of an end trade node, but it does out out of everywhere else. In the English Channel, we have 5 trade directions coming in, 2 from the New World, 1 from Africa, and 2 from Europe, namely from Champagne and Lubeck. To understand how the nodes and filtering works, we need to understand what trade value and trade power are. Trade value is the amount of ducats generated by the goods within your node, that is, the goods within the provinces within that node. The value can stay in the node, or it can be filtered out of the node into adjacent nodes if there is a trade wind that takes it there. Such as in the case of Lubeck, we have 1.56 ducats worth of trade value filtering out of the trade node into the English Channel node. Trade power is the share of a node that a country has. So say for example in the English Channel, Holland has 12% trade power, which means that Holland will be able to collect 12% of the trade value from that node itself, meaning out of the 13.4 ducats in this node, we collect 1.82 ducats, which is 12% of the trade value in the node multiplied by the trade efficiency that we have. That's another major modifier that we need to understand, because trade efficiency multiplies whatever we're collecting from the nodes. Trade power is also used to transfer value between one node to another. So if we have 1% trade power in the Champagne node, then we will be transferring 1% of the trade value from the Champagne node into whatever node we are currently transferring in. In our case, that is the English Channel node. But take note, it is not just us that is doing the transferring. Right now, there's multiple nations doing this, including Brabant, Flanders, and East Frisia. The added value of all of our countries within this node gets transferred in the node that we want the value to be transferred into. Now, I know what some of you are asking, is it possible to have more than just the 3 pre-established end trade nodes? Technically, no. However, you can make what we call a pseudo end trade node, where we hold 100% of the trade power in a node, preferably your main trade node. By holding 100% of the trade power, we prevent any of the trade value within that node from filtering outside of the node. It's exactly what's happening in the Byzantine campaign I'm doing right now. Since I hold 100% of the power, all the value remains here, as well as all the value incoming from the Crimean, Alexandrian, and Aleppo nodes. And as you noticed, the value is completely different from the value at the start of the campaign. That is because as you progress in a game, the value of the trade nodes increases. There's 2 ways to increase the trade value of your node. First one, you can develop the production development in your node's provinces, which increases the local value. And the second way is to increase your trade power in adjacent nodes and use that to filter in the trade value of adjacent nodes into yours. So because of the trade power that I have in Crimea, I'm transferring 4.78 ducats. If I was to increase this, I would transfer significantly more ducats into my Constantinople node. Going back to the trade screen, to give an easy rundown, trade efficiency multiplies how many ducats you gain from trade collected in your nodes, because you only gain ducats from your main trade node as well as from every node in which you are collecting. Other important modifiers to keep in mind are trade steering, which affects how much trade value gets transferred from one node to another by your merchants assigned to transferring trade. Global trade power is a percentage increase to the trade power you have in all nodes around the world, meaning as the Byzantines, if you get enough global trade power from, say, trade ideas, and maybe even from the policy between trade ideas with infrastructure, you could use your merchants to transfer quite a lot of value from nodes where you have no provinces, for example, such as the Ethiopian node, where we have 9% trade power, despite not owning a single province within the node itself. You can double down on this by creating a massive trade fleet. A frequently asked question is, what is mercantilism and is it worth it? Should I even bother with it? This is honestly a question that many even more experienced players don't know the answer to, and here's the truth. Mercantilism is one of those values that's good to have, it does not hurt, but in most cases it's best not to invest actual diplomatic power to increase it, as the return from it is not as big, with certain exceptions of course. Mercantilism increases your provincial trade power modifier multiplier. So if you have 100 mercantilism, you get 200% provincial trade power increase, meaning your provinces will have a lot more trade power than most. But that being said, diplomatic power is a rare commodity, and spending 100 or close to it for just 1% mercantilism is 100% not worth it. You can get mercantilism from other ways, such as giving out monopolies, and that means you get 1 mercantilism every time you renew a monopoly. There's events and even decisions that can increase your mercantilism, but you need to take into account your particular situation. For example, if you have one province that produces wine in 1444 and you're planning on not expanding for the next 10 years, where you take other wine provinces, then you get 8 years worth of production from that monopoly on wine and 1 mercantilism. You basically lose 2 years worth of production. So in our case, we would lose roughly 4 or 5 ducats of production, which is a fair trade-off for 1 mercantilism. But then again, you need to make sure you have enough privilege slots, because there's a lot of other privileges that are way more important than monopolies that you should be giving out. And you also need to remember, if you do expand, the new provinces that you conquered which have wine will not give you any production income, even though you've conquered the provinces after you've given out the monopoly. So it is very, very situational when you should give out monopolies and when you shouldn't, just to get that 1 mercantilism. Earlier in your campaign, when production doesn't give as much money, it can be worth it, but after the 1500s, I strongly recommend not giving out any monopolies, as you will be losing massive amounts of money by comparison to the early part of the campaign. Aside from mercantilism, another often overlooked trade value is inland bonus. This represents the trade power that your nation has over inland trade nodes. That means areas where your ships cannot reach, such as the Vienna trade node, the Saxon trade node. Your inland bonus is a third of your country's development, and it can be influenced by policies and ideas, as well as by monuments, such as the one in Morocco that offers 33% caravan power. Caravan power is a modifier that increases as a percentage your inland bonus. So to get higher inland bonus, it's pretty much getting more development. Not necessarily the amount of provinces, but the amount of development within those provinces. And last but not least, goods produced is the most important value in the entire screen. It increases the amount of goods produced in your provinces by a percentage amount. So if you have 10% goods produced modifier, your provinces produce 10% more goods everywhere around your empire. That means more ducats from production income and more from trade, as it affects the trade value within your nodes as well. That's why when choosing idea groups, it's always a good idea to go for ideas that have policies with goods produced modifier, such as trade quantity, trade infrastructure, trade religious, as well as, of course, directly getting the ideas from, say, economic, which gives another 10% goods produced modifier, or plutocratic if you are a republic. Now, the big question, and I'm sure a lot of you are asking, is when should I transfer and when should I collect with my merchants? Well, that really depends on your game, and there's some guidelines, but the best practice, honestly, is just to try both. See if you get more ducats from having your merchants transferring or from having them collecting everywhere. If you have a main node, which is either an end trade node, or you have a big amount of trade power in, say, above 50%, as the Venetians start off with in the Venice trade node, then it is best to transfer into that node from all the nodes that filter into it. But if you have a smaller percentage of power in multiple nodes, say 5% everywhere, then it's honestly just best to collect in every single one of those nodes, since you're not going to be getting too much either way. Early on in campaign, especially if you're not a trade republic or you're a smaller nation with not great trade modifiers, you will need to build your economy off of tax until you get some either trade ideas or more provinces with higher trade power to actually become a viable trade nation. So make sure you prioritize what's important in your particular game. Trade companies are a great tool at your disposal to gain extra merchants that you can use to filter trade into your main trade nodes. You can easily get merchants by targeting a low development trade nodes, such as the Tunis Safi trade node. Pretty much all the North African areas can be turned into trade companies easily. Once you have a few provinces within those nodes, you can get your merchant by establishing a trade company, and you need to ensure you have at least 51% of the province trade power in the region to get the merchant. And obviously, you do not need to use the merchant necessarily in the trade company where you gain the merchant from. So we can get a merchant from the Tunis node and we can use them wherever we want. We can say use them in the Persian node to filter trade into Aleppo, which afterwards filters into Constantinople. Do take note, however, once you've added provinces to a trade company, you cannot convert them anymore. So make sure you convert them before you add these provinces to the trade company to avoid rebellions and so that you can still culturally convert these lands. And by going to the state screen, once you've established a trade company, you have unique buildings that you can construct that give bonuses both to that particular region as well as global bonuses. In the case of the third building, we can get 5 land force limit for our entire country, 50% trade steering in the Barbary Coast Charter, for example, or just a flat increase to manpower and sailors. Even as a smaller trade nation, you can really make use of trade companies around Africa, Southeast Asia, and even the New World to increase the trade power in those regions, as well as to get the extra merchants or to increase your land force limit and naval force limit, especially if you're a smaller nation earlier in the campaign. Having a strong economic base is half the fight in EU4. You also need to understand how armies work in order to win in this game. So let's say you're fighting the Ottoman Empire as the Byzantines, the last holdout of Rome. Your armies are outnumbered and weaker, and you start with the deteriorating army privilege, which lowers your morale of armies by 15% and your reinforcement speed by another 10%. So how can you win then? Well, there's a few things we can take advantage of: combat with generals and the good old divide and conquer tactics. First off, let's take a look at the military tab to better understand it. So army tradition is a value that is gained from winning or from losing battles, and in return, more army tradition means you can hire better generals, and you also can get up to 25% morale of armies when reaching 100% army tradition. Morale of armies determines how long your armies can stay in a fight for, whilst discipline multiplies the damage that your units inflict on the enemies, as well as it lowers the damage your units take in combat. In contrast to that, combat ability only increases the amount of damage that your units deal to the enemy. They do not lower the damage that your units take from combat. Aside from that, discipline also increases your military tactics, which in turn again reduces the damage your units take in combat. So overall, discipline is by far king in the game. Ideally, you want to have as much infantry combat ability and discipline as possible for your units, as in most cases infantry combat ability is easier to attain than discipline. Quality increases combat ability for all 3 types of units, and then you get an extra 5% discipline once you finish all of your quality ideas. Now there's a lot of policies that also mixed in increase the combat ability, such as innovative ideas with quality increases 15% infantry combat ability, and you also can get more discipline from mixing in economic with quality for that matter. Early on, if you're lucky, you can also get a discipline or a morale of armies advisor, which leads to the age-old question in the Europa Universalis IV community: what's better, morale or discipline? Well, we need to understand the difference between the two. First off, morale, quite frankly, just makes it so your units stay in the fight for longer, which can be a good or a bad thing sometimes, whilst discipline actually makes your units better. My personal opinion is that discipline is always king, since it means you lose less units and you inflict more damage, whilst morale of armies can even get you completely stack wiped, since it means your units will be in the fight for longer, giving the enemy more time to grind more of your units down. So say if you have really high morale of armies and you're fighting an enemy that has really high discipline, then you give the enemy the time to wipe out your entire army since you're in the fight for longer. You need to find a good balance between how long your units should stay in the fight, considering the size of your army and the strength and the size of your enemy's army. As the Byzantines in particular, it's best to rely on mercenaries to win early on, and you can also use the Albanian general Skanderberg, which has 5 shock, 5 fire, 5 maneuver, and 1 siege. Certain mercenary companies like the Palace Guards actually do not take up any force limit, so we're only 16 out of 11 with our land force limit despite having 21 actual units hired. Also, the impending Doom mission gives us 15% mercenary cost reduction if we get an alliance with the Pope and 10% morale of armies. We can get another 5% morale of armies from conquering Epirus, and we can also get quite a bit of money from the Serbians that will help us maintain our army and not go into complete financial disaster during the war itself. With this, I want to illustrate that using your mission tree, if you have it available, will always be a massive asset in your campaigns. So make sure you take the time and read through them carefully, because some missions really give some very overpowered modifiers or even flat out big chunks of money or manpower. When faced with the overwhelming odds, it's always great to make sure you keep your units close together and only separate your armies when you're trying to bait the enemy soldiers. The AI is actually hard-coded to take advantage of disunited units, so you can use this to your advantage. At the same time, if you see yourself an opportunity where the enemy armies have been divided, make sure you take advantage, especially if you get Skanderberg to join in on the fun, then you're likely going to be winning those battles. But do remember that you have a limited amount of manpower pool, which in our case is not getting affected as much because all the mercenaries have their own manpower pool too. So whilst you're grinding the enemy army's manpower pool, they're simply grinding your mercenary manpower pools. That is basically limited by the amount of money that you have, so keep that in mind as well. This cannot go on forever. Also, if the enemy is sieging down mountain forts as they are doing right now in Albania, that is an advantage of -2 dice roll for attacker that you would be having since you would be the defender. You can also take advantage of the AI's overconfidence at times, such as them thinking that they can actually take this fortification without us attacking them, and we're also going to be winning this since again it is a defensive battle for us. There we go, that was another victory for us. We can withdraw because the rest of the enemy army, which broke away from the siege in Constantinople, calculates that it can arrive in time to reinforce. One of the most important things in Europa Universalis IV is knowing how many units your armies should have throughout the campaign. At the start of the game, your combat width will be only 20, so your armies should be 20 strong if possible. However, mostly the bigger nations like France, the Ottomans, England will be able to field such massive armies, whilst the majority of nations will have around 10 to 15, 16,000 units, maybe even less than that. So what should your army composition look like? Combat width represents the amount of regiments that will fight at the same time. So the higher the combat width, the more soldiers will be fighting in the front line. If you have an army that is 24,000 strong, only 20 of those 24 will be fighting, with the other soldiers remaining in reserves. But at the same time, if you have an army that is 20,000 strong and your enemy is only 6,000 strong, then you have 20,000 units inflicting damage on 6 or 7,000 units, making it very easy to stack wipe the entire enemy army since they are vastly outnumbered. As you start the campaign, you want to have around 4,000 cavalry units if you are playing as a standard Western European nation. You can increase the amount of cavalry if you're playing as an Eastern nation. However, infantry still is significantly cheaper than cavalry, so even as an Eastern European, it's honestly best to just have 4,000 cavalry, with the rest of the 16,000 to reach the 20 combat width being infantry. As you progress in the campaign, you should slowly be adding more and more infantry units and artillery pieces when you unlock them. Initially 4 should be enough once you first unlock it military tech 7, but then as you progress in military technology, add more and more. By military tech 16, you should have a full back row of artillery. In my case, the combat width is 29, so I should technically have 20 to 29 artillery pieces in every one of my armies. The earlier artillery pieces unlocked at technology 7 are pretty bad, so you really just use them for sieging down fortifications. Military tech 10 and 13 artillery starts to progressively get better and better, with military tech 16 chamber demi cannon being an extremely efficient unit, so you really want to have your entire back row covered with your chamber demi cannons by military tech 16. Seeing as an army as large as that will be difficult to supply in most provinces, it is best to just split it in half and move half of the army to the adjacent province so you do not suffer from attrition, and only merge the two army stacks into one bigger whenever you're engaging an enemy army. So whenever you're not engaging, your army should technically be 2 separate stacks of identical numbers moving side by side to avoid attrition. Another important aspect of combat is knowing where you can and where you cannot go on the map itself. Zone of control is a mechanic where provinces within the zone of control of a fort will have the protection of said fort and will prevent nations from passing through without having conquered the fortification. That being said, if your fort is mothballed, it doesn't prevent movement. As long as you can afford it though, it is preferred to always keep your forts maintained for two reasons. First off, you just really don't know when someone decides to attack you, and it will take a while for your garrison to fully replenish after you started maintaining your fort. And second, your forts actually help you keep army tradition high as long as they are paid for. And one very important thing I know is going through your mind right now is, how is the AI passing through my zone of control when I clearly have a fort preventing that from happening? A reason could be that the AI is getting control by having access through the lands controlled by a neighbor that is bordering your fortification, such as in my case, if somebody gets military access through Kazan, which borders my fort in Nizhny Novgorod, they would be able to pass through. This happens because the AI's pathfinding looks for ways around forts, often through neutral or allied lands, especially if it allows them to get closer to their goal. So in short, whilst your fort may block direct access, the AI can still move through it indirectly via a neighboring country that has open borders or the right access. It's an interesting mechanic that can sometimes feel a little bit frustrating, but it's part of the game's complexity when it comes down to AI movement. Now, despite the AI bypassing our forts at time, it is vital that you know exactly where you should be building your fortification. Ideally, you want to have forts in your capital at all times, but also in mountainous or rough terrain that give a debuff to the attacker, such as the dice roll -1 for attacker in woods, as well as don't forget to spread out your forts and cover as many provinces as you possibly can, since remember that forts not only act as defensive barriers, but they also lower devastation 10 times faster than you'd normally be lowering devastation in your provinces. Provinces within the zone of control of our forts, as you can see, have the extra friendly forts devastation reduction modifier, whilst provinces outside of the zone of control of any fort do not have said modifier, so it is much more difficult to lose devastation once we have it in these particular provinces until we build a fortification that extends the zone of control over these provinces as well. One of the hardest things in Europa Universalis IV, no matter how many hours you have, is knowing when to give out privileges and when to remove them. There's certain privileges that you should give out always, namely the +1 power privilege for all 3 of the estates. You can actually keep these for the entirety of the campaign, all the way up to 1821, but if you value absolutism and you need to get up to 100, you could potentially revoke the privileges at that point in the 1600s, or you can fire the court and country disaster, which can give an extra 20 max absolutism, so you can again keep these till the end of the campaign. These are by far the most powerful privileges in the game, and the sooner you give them, the more you take advantage of them. Of course, afterwards, do summon the diet for the extra loyalty and influence, as well as you can do your mission and seize crownlands, because you will be at 5% or 10% in the case of Hungary, because they start with more crownlands than more nations. Whatever the case, that does offer us some debuffs, so what we could do is option 1, not give any other privileges to keep the influence low, in which case we should not even summon the diet, since that also offers 5% influence for all of the estates, and expand, take lands, and by taking lands we increase our crownlands. The lower the influence, the more crownlands we gain from taking lands, or if you don't want to be expansionist, after every 5 years you can seize another 5 crownlands. Do remember though that if your loyalty goes below 30%, it may trigger a rebellion with your estates. Early in the game, certain privileges are absolutely vital to give and don't really have much of an actual drawback. These privileges include Religious Diplomat, which is great to get more relations with other nations of your faith, as well as 1 Diplo reputation. Clerical Education, which helps with getting reform progress faster for your government reforms. Increased Levies will always be amazing since it offers more manpower. Early in the campaign, manpower is extremely difficult to accrue. Supremacy over the crown also is amazing since it increases the loyalty of of all of your estates, but it does increase the influence, so keep that in mind as well. We want to reach an average of 50% equilibrium for the loyalty, so that the loyalty does trickle above or at 50%, meaning when we seize crownlands, if it is above 50, we don't get rebellions, most likely, since it lowers the loyalty by 20% every time you seize the crownlands. Grand Court position is also great. However, keep in mind, sometimes nobility will require some specific privileges to be given out, such as the strong duchies if you have a lot of subjects, and that also means you need to give out nobility integration policy so you don't get the debuffs after you've annexed your subjects. And because of that, Grand Court positions is not necessarily a priority, especially if you're planning to have subjects. And even more so if you want to give nobility in the officer corps once you've gained a little bit of army tradition, since this does help make your army stronger, maintain your army tradition, as well as makes hiring generals significantly cheaper. For the burghers, a burgher financial demand, burgher economic freedom are absolutely brilliant early in the campaign. It really doubles down on both your trade and your taxation income. And remember that early in the campaign, taxation income is absolute king. Indebted to the burghers also can be an amazing early privilege, so you get a big lump of money that you can use for early on wars or for building up fortifications, churches, and whatever other buildings you might need in the early campaign to double down on your economy. The best part about these loans is that they are only 1%, so the interest we pay on them is basically little to nothing. Patronage of the arts also is great for the burghers, and if you do have a fleet, private trade fleets is amazing. However, for the Hungarians, we do not start with any sort of fleet. These privileges for us mean that we already have 50% equilibrium for loyalty for the burghers, as well as for the nobility, but not with the clergy. So some other privileges you could give out are the clerical advisory council, as well as the aristocratic counselors and commercial advisory board, all of which lower the cost of your advisors, but they increase the cost of getting stability. So make sure you give this privilege out after you've gained at least one stability, just so you can get the passive prosperity growth in your provinces. As for revoking these privileges, the big question overall, by the 1600s, when absolutism will trigger, you should have started revoking most of them, keeping only the +1 power privileges and whatever other vital privileges you consider based on your particular situation. However, do take note, if you're not planning to do a world conquest, absolutism is useless. This is simply a mechanic used to get provinces faster, since it allows you to conquer more lands in one war. So if you're planning to play toll or just not expand too much, keep all your privileges. It is not mandatory to revoke your privileges when absolutism hits. Also, extremely great privileges are the clergy, nobility, and the burgher land rights, as well as any other land rights you might have based on how many estates you have. Since it increases your governing capacity, it does make you lose 5 crownlands. So do make sure you have enough crownlands when you give this out. Basically have above 25 crownlands so you do not get the autonomy debuff. One of the best ways to enjoy Europa Universalis IV after you've played on all of the continents is to actually set up your custom nation. That's right, we're pressing the forbidden button, and I'm sure you forgot it's even there. With custom nations, you can create whatever you'd like, be it a Manchu culture, Prussian kingdom, or the lost world of Atlantis. One cool thing to keep in mind when making your own custom nation is that you can actually change the starting culture of all provinces that you own that have the same culture as your capital at game start. So for example, if we make our capital in Prague, all Czech provinces that we own with the custom nation will become whatever our custom nation's primary culture is. That means we can restore Roman culture and replace all Greek provinces with Roman if we like to. You can also start with any government reform you'd like, as long as you have the points for it and the prerequisites for it, such as being in the Muslim religious group in order to get feudal theocracy. The ideas you can select for your custom nations can also be pretty powerful and unique, having +1 cavalry shock and +1 infantry fire from the start of the campaign can pretty much destroy any army you're going to be encountering in your game. Or you can start with Siberian Frontier as a 1 province minor in the New World, which means you can colonize the entirety of the Americas before the colonial nations even arrive. It really is an untapped source of fun, and we strongly recommend you don't miss out on it. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you learned something from it, make sure to leave a like and subscribe. My name is Ludiet. It was a pleasure to explain a little bit about the greatest grand strategy game I ever played.